legalized advertising trade cards, but not private postcards, 60 million cards were sold. To put this figure in perspective, consider the fact that the 1870 population of the United States was tallied in the census at 40 million people. The postcard craze did not develop in a vacuum, no matter how suddenly pervasive they appeared to early 20th century commentators. Their popularity was definitively tied to the massive greeting card industry that bloomed during the 19th century. There are key social phenomena to take into account when considering the postcard boom. By the turn of the century, industrialization had irreversibly altered the pace of social and cultural life in America, creating a demand for a quick form of communication that responded to the needs of an increasingly mobile and time-crunched population. With its abbreviated writing space, the postcard met this need. The discourse around postcards and their uses paralleled the way earlier United States Postal Service developments were viewed. For example, the emergent letter-writing nation of the early to mid-19th century sparked discussion in which many people lamented that letter writing could not take the place of good old-fashioned face-to-face conversation. Commentators on letter writing in the 1830s worried that what could be said in an hour's conversation would take days to write, and that the intimacy of face-to-face conversation would be lost if the people of the Republic took to writing letters instead of talking. Part of the anxiety regarding the switch from face-to-face intimacy to letter writing was likewise a result of increasing mobility. Families were dispersing across the United States as Western migration to newly available farmlands, which we know weren't as available as we thought they were, and moved to cities. Industrial innovations, such as the railroad, that increased the distance between people and thus necessitated letter writing, while shortening the time messages took to travel from one place to another, were viewed as a key factor behind the demise of the art of face-to-face conversation. Thus, as letter writing became widely established in American society in the 1830s and 1840s, much discussion about the proper way to write letters emerged. A similar conversation occurred with the postcard and the rhetoric surrounding it in the popular press by the turn of the century. However, it was not so much that new technology suddenly made postcards attractive in the early 20th century, but that the federal government deregulated who could print and mail postcards and significantly decreased postage fees, while after 1907, increasing the space available for written messages. This democratization of the mail meant that larger swaths of the American public could afford to purchase and send postcards. In fact, during much of the 19th century, it was cheaper to send newspapers than personal letters. Letter writing was actually so expensive that people would resort to secretly writing comments in the margins of newspapers before sending them to friends and family, even though the fines were stiff if they were caught. With the postcard's increased space for writing messages, and with the bulky and heavy envelope no longer needed, more could be said at a cheaper rate than in a standard greeting card or letter. We can easily see how people used postcards to new purpose and how they got used to the changes in the federal regulation of writing space by looking at just one postcard series from this moment. Between 1898 and 1907, postcards had undivided backs, or versos, where the only writing legally allowed was the address of the intended recipient. Postcard users commonly negotiated this lack of personalized message space by writing on the image or face side of the card, and manufacturers frequently incorporated blank space on the front of the card to give senders a means to include a few words of his or her own. When the divided back postcard was approved by Congress in 1907, publishers recycled older, undivided era imagery for use on the new cards rather than pay artists and designers for fresh images that did not include empty writing space on the front. But people still used the face space to write their messages despite the more ample space available on the back, as this postcard makes clear. And if you're wondering what it says, it's hilarious. It says, "He's pretty near the edge, that's what comes of foolin'." It's really endearing. There are several other differences to be noted, however, between letters and greeting cards and postcards. What distinguished the postcard from handwritten letters and from greeting cards was the fact that it was the first personal mass communication medium that merged written text with visual images and captions all on the same picture plane. Though illuminated stationery was used during the mid-19th century, and greeting cards were well established decades earlier, nothing quite like the postcard had ever been seen before. Historian David Henkin argues in his book, The Postal Age, that, quote, the letter sheets and illustrated envelopes published, purchased, and posted were early model postcards, not by philatelic criteria, of course, but insofar as they introduced and popularized the link between mail and pre-printed visual culture, end quote. However, the visual and thematic possibilities were far more circumscribed in early illuminated stationery, if not greeting cards. Much illuminated stationery, in fact, depicted the gold rush or Civil War themes. And this is actually from the Civil War. The 5th Maine Regiment Museum on Peaks Island has a bunch of letters. Quite a few of them are on these illuminated stationery pieces, I guess you would call them, and they were written during the Civil War, so this is from the Civil War specifically, which were obviously very important in their moment, but failed to reflect the larger diversity of American social and cultural life. The possibilities for endless choice represented by postcard imagery, coupled with the fact that they were not sealed in envelopes, marks a significant divergence from illuminated stationery or greeting cards. Significantly, for the first time, the people of the United States had a writing medium that allowed for unprecedented combinations of images, pre-printed captions, and personal commentary, all at an affordable price. Postcards were also public documents in the way that letters and greeting cards were not. Henkin points out that the early post offices were public spaces where people joined together for a variety of reasons, not the least of which were the opportunities for social interaction, much like the neighborhood saloon or church. Because people gathered at post offices, letter writing initially incited fears over confidentiality. However, outside of the public knowledge of who was sending and receiving mail in a particular locale, the more private envelope letter and greeting card functioned differently than the postcard, which was clearly and openly public. Since they were not concealed within an envelope, anyone and everyone through whose hand the postcard passed could read the messages inscribed upon the cards. These fears over confidentiality should not be considered through the lens of our 21st century eye, however. While many postcards, greeting cards, or letters might pass through a city too large for its inhabitants to take note of the individuals sending and receiving mail, a good deal of these materials, particularly in the 19th century, clearly passed through post offices where everyone truly knew each other's name. Breaching the dividing line between public and private space, the postcard appeared precisely at the same moment that the division between public and private and often gendered behavior was collapsing. What better media form to incite the ire of the highbrowed literati than the postcard, whose form broke down boundaries between the public and the private? It is difficult, if not impossible, however, to read the images we find on both greeting cards and postcards divorced from the time period in which they occurred. The Progressive Era frames my subject as it was within these years, the 1890s to the First World War, that postcards were first available for private purchase and enjoyed the height of their popularity. Much anxiety existed during this period over how to determine an individual's racial identity, what rights women should or shouldn't have, how the United States might proceed in an expanding capitalistic market economy and a global political arena rife with imperialistic competition, and what social and cultural changes would result from the increasing visibility of people who did not conform to traditional gender and Anglo-racial norms. Importantly, masculinity was also under fire during the Progressive Era, as Teddy Roosevelt called men to action in the face of the hardy working classes and immigrants who seemed far more manly than the increasingly effeminate middle and upper class brain workers. Perhaps more importantly, the Progressive Era was a time when a distinct middle class emerged in the United States. The ideals and ideologies of the middle class, of course, shaped the political and cultural landscape as quickly and as often as those ideals and ideologies were themselves changing. Postcards help shape this landscape and we can gauge their influence by tracing what images were printed, how they circulated, and how people commented on them. Most of the turmoil over the postcard ultimately came down to aspects of its imagery and usage that were positively titillating for the time. When not discussing the postcard as a germ or judging their aesthetic value, and often in the same breath,